the first-century Jesus movement as a legitimate sect within Judaism. A re-examination through interpretive diversity and historical context. Abstract, this thesis argues that the first-century Jesus movement, led by the Jewish Rabbi Yeshua, Jesus of Nazareth, should be recognized as a legitimate sect within the diverse religious landscape of Judaism during that period. By analyzing the historical context of first-century Judaism, the interpretative flexibility inherent in Torah and messianic claims, the inclusive practices of Jesus towards Gentiles, and early rabbinic perspectives, this thesis contends that the movement's eventual separation and non-acceptance by later rabbinic Judaism was not solely a matter of theological incompatibility, but also influenced by factors of power dynamics and the gatekeeping of emerging orthodoxies. By refining the criteria for a legitimate sect within this context, this thesis proposes a reevaluation of the Jesus movement's initial place within Judaism, advocating for the recognition of its validity as one expression among the many that existed within the rich tapestry of first-century Jewish faith. 1. Introduction. The contested identity of the Jesus movement. The historical origins of Christianity lie within first-century Judaism, centered around the figure of Jesus, a Jew who was recognized as a rabbi and gathered a following of Jewish disciples. This movement, however, ultimately diverged from what became mainstream rabbinic Judaism, leading to its eventual designation as a separate religion. This thesis posits that the initial Jesus movement warrants recognition as a legitimate sect within the diverse spiritual landscape of first-century Judaism. This argument rests on the inherent interpretative flexibility within Jewish scripture and messianic expectations, the historical precedent of diverse Jewish sects, the inclusive practices of Jesus that resonated with foundational Abrahamic principles, and a nuanced understanding of early interactions between the movement and nascent rabbinic thought. By re-examining the historical context and challenging the notion of a monolithic first-century Judaism, this thesis aims to demonstrate that the Jesus movement's early form possessed the characteristics of a valid, albeit ultimately non-dominant, expression of Jewish faith. 2. The diverse landscape of first-century Judaism. A context for the Jesus movement. First-century Judea was not characterized by a singular, unified form of faith practice. Instead, it was a vibrant milieu of various Jewish groups, each with differing interpretations of Torah, Halakha Jewish law, and messianic prophecies. Groups such as the Pharisees, who emphasized the oral Torah and developed detailed legal interpretations, contrasted with the Sadducees, an aristocratic priestly group, who adhered more strictly to a literal interpretation of the written Torah and rejected the concept of resurrection. The Essenes, a more ascetic group exemplified by the Qumran community, held distinct eschatological beliefs and communal practices. The Zealots, advocating for armed resistance against Roman rule, represented a politically charged expression of Jewish messianic fervor. These examples demonstrate that differing interpretations of core tenets, including law and messianic prophecy, were not only tolerated, but were integral to the vibrant spiritual discourse of the time. The emergence of the Jesus movement, with its own interpretations of these very texts, should be understood within this established context of interpretive pluralism, avoiding the fallacy of assuming a monolithic, normative Judaism against which it deviated. 3. Interpretative flexibility in Torah and messianic claims. The basis for inclusion. A central argument for recognizing the Jesus movement as a Jewish sect lies in the inherent interpretative flexibility within the Hebrew Bible. Torah and the prophetic texts, including those concerning the Messiah, have been subject to a range of interpretations throughout Jewish history. Different Jewish groups often held varying views on the application of laws and the nature and timing of messianic fulfillment. The Jesus movement offered its own interpretations of these texts, seeing Jesus as the fulfillment of messianic prophecies and emphasizing the spirit of the law alongside its literal observance. Jesus' emphasis on love and compassion, as seen in his teachings on the greatest commandments, Matthew 22:37-40, drawing from Deuteronomy 6:5 and Leviticus 19:18, resonated with prophetic calls for social justice and ethical behavior that transcended mere ritual observance. This act of interpretation, while differing from that of other Jewish groups, was consistent with the established practice of engaging with and understanding sacred texts within Judaism. as long as these interpretations engaged with the Torah and messianic claims. They operated within the broad framework of Jewish theological discourse. 4. The inclusivity of Jesus and alignment with Abrahamic principles, expanding the boundaries. The acceptance of Gentiles into Jesus' discipleship, a key aspect of the early movement, can be viewed as an extension of the inclusive principles inherent in the Abrahamic covenant. Abraham's covenant was intended to bless all nations, Genesis 12:3, suggesting a trajectory of inclusion beyond the direct descendants of Jacob. Jesus' outreach to Gentiles, evidenced in the Gospels through interactions with figures like the Roman centurion, Matthew 8:5-13, and the Syrophoenician woman, Mark 7:24-30, can be interpreted as aligning with this broader Abrahamic vision. Furthermore, the emphasis on faith as the primary means of righteousness, a central tenet of both early Christianity, Romans 3:28, and foundational Jewish theology, as seen in the example of Abraham in Genesis 15:6, provided a theological basis for including those who embraced belief in the Elohim of Israel. Regardless of their ethnic origin, this focus on shared faith in Elohim, the Elohim of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, suggests a fundamental unity with the core of Jewish faith. 5. The role of power dynamics and gatekeeping in the movement's exclusion. The eventual separation and non-acceptance of the Jesus movement by later Rabbinic Judaism was not solely a matter of irreconcilable theological differences. The historical context, including the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE and the subsequent consolidation of rabbinic authority, played a significant role. The loss of the Temple, a central unifying institution, necessitated the development of new structures and boundaries for Jewish identity and practice, primarily under the leadership of the rabbis. The messianic claims of Jesus, particularly in light of the failed Bar Kokhba revolt, 132-135 CE, which further solidified rabbinic skepticism towards such claims, and the inclusion of Gentiles without full conversion, including adherence to circumcision and the entirety of halakha as interpreted by the rabbis, were deemed to fall outside these newly established boundaries. This process of defining orthodoxy and excluding dissenting views reflects the inherent power dynamics within religious movements and the act of gatekeeping that often accompanies the establishment of a dominant theological framework. While theological differences were undoubtedly present, the solidification of rabbinic authority and the need to define a distinct Jewish identity in the face of Roman rule and the rise of Christianity contributed to the marginalization of the Jesus movement within the Jewish tradition. This isn't meant to encourage anti-Semitic sentiment. On the contrary, the intent here is to bring greater unification with Jewish peoples. 6. Illustrating interpretive diversity. Case studies within first-century Judaism. The assertion that first-century Judaism was characterized by significant interpretive diversity requires concrete examples. Consider the differing approaches to halakha, Jewish law, between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Pharisees, based on their understanding of both the written and oral Torah, developed detailed regulations concerning Sabbath observance, prohibiting activities beyond basic sustenance to ensure complete rest. In contrast, the Sadducees, rejecting the authority of the oral Torah, held a more literal interpretation, potentially allowing for activities deemed work by the Pharisees. Similarly, messianic expectations varied widely. While some texts, like Psalm 2, depict a royal Messiah, others, like Isaiah 53, portray a suffering servant. The Essenes, as evidenced in the Dead Sea Scrolls, held unique messianic beliefs, anticipating two messiahs, a priestly Messiah and a royal Messiah, reflecting a distinct interpretive framework of prophetic texts. These examples underscore that diverse interpretations of core tenets, including law and messianic prophecy, were intrinsic to the spiritual landscape within which the Jesus movement emerged. 7. Textual interpretations of the early Jesus movement, a Jewish lens, to further substantiate the claim of the Jesus movement's initial legitimacy. It is crucial to examine how its early followers interpreted Jewish scripture and messianic claims. The Gospels themselves, while later compiled and edited, contain instances of Jesus engaging with Torah and prophetic texts in ways that, while distinct, were not necessarily alien to Jewish hermeneutical practices. For example, Jesus' citation of Hosea 6:6, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice," in his defense of eating with tax collectors and sinners, Matthew 9:13, aligns with a prophetic emphasis on ethical behavior over ritualistic formalism, a theme present within Jewish prophetic tradition. His followers interpreted prophecies like Isaiah 53 concerning a suffering servant as prefiguring his crucifixion, a messianic interpretation that, while controversial, engaged directly with existing Jewish scripture. The early sermons in the book of Acts, such as Peter's sermon in Acts 2, meticulously cite psalms and prophetic texts to argue for Jesus' resurrection and messianic identity, demonstrating an attempt to persuade fellow Jews based on shared scriptural authority and established modes of Jewish biblical interpretation, even if their conclusions differed. 8. Early rabbinic perspectives, navigating the murky waters. While later rabbinic literature clearly demarcates Judaism from Christianity, examining earlier allusions to or interactions with early Jesus followers can offer valuable insights. The Talmud contains references to minim, heretics or sectarians, and while the precise identity of these groups is debated, some scholars argue that they included early Christians. For instance, references to individuals performing healings in the name of Yeshu, and discussions about those who deviate from normative Jewish practice might reflect early encounters with the Jesus movement. The nature of the criticisms often centered on theological claims regarding the Messiah and perceived breaches of Jewish law. However, the very act of engaging with these groups within rabbinic discourse suggests that they were initially seen as an internal Jewish phenomenon requiring refutation, rather than a completely foreign entity from the outset. Understanding these early interactions, while acknowledging the potential for anachronism and polemical intent, provides a more complex picture than a simple narrative of immediate and complete rejection. 9. Refining the definition of a legitimate sect within first-century Judaism. To avoid ambiguity, a clearer definition of legitimate sect within the context of first-century Judaism is necessary. This definition should not solely rely on whether a group's beliefs ultimately aligned with the trajectory of rabbinic Judaism. Instead, it should focus on shared foundational beliefs, adherence to the core tenets of Judaism, such as the Shema, Deuteronomy 6:4, the covenant with Abraham, and the authority of the Torah, even with differing interpretations. The early Jesus movement, comprised of Jews who worshiped the Elohim of Israel and acknowledged the authority of the Hebrew Bible, fulfills this criterion. Engagement with Jewish practices, participation in Jewish communal life, observance of key rituals, to varying degrees and interpretations, and a connection to the temple before its destruction. The Gospels depict Jesus and his disciples participating in Jewish festivals and temple worship, indicating their initial integration within Jewish practices. Utilizing accepted modes of scriptural interpretation, engaging with the Hebrew Bible through methods recognized within Jewish tradition, even if leading to novel conclusions. The early Jesus movement's reliance on scriptural exegesis to support their claims, as seen in the New Testament, demonstrates their engagement with Jewish hermeneutical traditions, recognition, even if contested, within the broader Jewish milieu, the group being identifiable and interacting within the Jewish community, not existing as a completely separate entity from its inception. The New Testament narratives depict the early followers of Jesus interacting and debating with other Jewish groups, indicating their initial presence within the broader Jewish social and spiritual landscape. By these criteria, the early Jesus movement, comprised of Jewish individuals who continued to identify as Jews, adhered to Jewish scriptures and practices, albeit with their own interpretations centered on Jesus, and initially operated within the Jewish community, can be argued to have constituted a legitimate sect, even if its unique interpretations and practices eventually led to separation. 10. Conclusion. Towards a more nuanced understanding of shared origins. By delving into specific examples of interpretive diversity, analyzing the textual engagements of the early Jesus movement, considering early rabbinic perspectives, and refining the definition of a legitimate sect, this thesis reinforces the argument that the first-century Jesus movement was not an alien entity imposed upon Judaism, but rather an expression of its internal dynamism. While the eventual divergence and non-acceptance by later rabbinic Judaism are undeniable historical realities, understanding the movement's initial context as a Jewish phenomenon allows for a more nuanced and historically accurate appreciation of the complex, Relationship between Judaism and Christianity. Recognizing the legitimacy of the early Jesus movement as a Jewish sect honors the rich tapestry of first-century Jewish thought and underscores the shared roots of two major world faiths, moving beyond simplistic narratives of immediate and absolute separation. This reevaluation encourages a deeper understanding of the interpretative richness within the Abrahamic heritage and the complex interplay of theological development, historical circumstances, and power dynamics that shape the distinct identities of Judaism and Christianity.